Yes. Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Rabbi Nicole Guzik here at Sinai Temple, and I'm just so pleased to welcome you to the Goldstine Scholar in Residence series. A special thank you, of course, to Roz and Abner for continuing to bring such incredible scholarship and insight and learning and growth to our community. We are grateful to you. And I have the pleasure of introducing our Scholar in Residence of 2021. And later speaking, of course, with her, I'm so happy to introduce Rabbi Delphine Horvilleur. And I'm pleased to introduce a little bit of information. Rabbi Delphine Horvilleur was born in Nancy, France on November 8th, 1974. When she was 18, she left to study medicine at the Hadassah Center at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem before returning to France to study journalism. She joined the editorial staff of France 2 from 2000 to 2003, serving notably in the Middle East office in Jerusalem. She then studied for 5 years in New York at the Rabbinical Seminary of the Hebrew Union College. And then following ordination in 2018, she became very involved. I'm sure you'll speak about this a little bit more. It was one of the rabbis of the movement Juif Liberal de France in Paris. In 2009, you took the helm of the Tenua Review, where you became editor-in-chief, and then 2012, managing editor. I wanted to make mention that since 2017, you've also been leading the Tenua workshop, study, and dialogue sessions that regularly bring together 300 people every month in Paris. But in particular, in 2020, during COVID-19 lockdown period, the online version of these workshops united tens of thousands of people every week. What a blessing. She is one of the founding members of CAREM, the Council of French-Speaking Liberal Rabbis. She is married and the mother of 3 children, which we collaborated a little bit on prior to coming on to this call. And so on behalf of the Sinai Temple community, I just want to thank you so much for giving your time and really your attention to what I know is an incredibly important topic, is the notion of equality compatible with chosenness. So in your homes, let's all give Rabbi a round of applause, and thank you so much for joining us. I know evening for you and afternoon for us.
Yes, thank you so much for this introduction, my dear colleague. I'm so happy to spend this moment with you and to be able to give these 3 sessions of study this week in San Francisco. It feels like I'm traveling, even though I'm staying here in my living room. It's nighttime, indeed, in Paris. So when I was offered to give these 3 sessions, I was asked by the congregation to give a title for these sessions, and I immediately thought of the classical triptych of the French Republic, you know, as a good citizen, a French citizen. I thought about Liberté, Egalité, Fraternité, and I decided it might be interesting to dive with you into these notions, to explore them through different lenses. So in our last session of study, we dive together into the notion of liberty, freedom, liberté. And today, indeed, I will offer maybe a reflection about the question of equality. Again, for this session, I want to apologize for my English, which is, I'm aware, a kind of mixture between different languages. I'm speaking English, always adding French and Hebrew words together, creating like a new language.
And you'll excuse me for my French, okay? We'll excuse each other.
Okay, it's a deal. In the last session, I spoke about what I believe is the importance of translation and the central role it played actually in my life in many occasions. I was blessed and lucky to live in 3 different countries in the past years. I lived in Israel, in Jerusalem, in New York, in the States, and I moved back to Paris a few years ago. And living in between different languages taught me a lot about the power of translation, but also, as I said in the last session, the power of misunderstandings and moments of lost in translation. You know, those moments when you're aware that you don't exactly understand what the other means, and the fact that the other might sometimes use the same word as you do, but he will use it very differently. And what I learned from that is a certain paradox. The fact that some people believe that we need to understand each other to talk, but I do believe, on the contrary, that conversation always depends upon a certain level of discrepancy, a certain level of miscommunication, or maybe a kind of blurriness in the conversation that invites and creates the possibility of a dialogue, as if perfect understanding could ruin actually the conversation and could ruin dialogue. And I believe it's a very sacred notion for our Jewish tradition, this notion of incomplete understanding or misunderstanding or mishearing. I even believe it's at the core of the rabbinic art of interpretation. You know, the rabbis believe in the freedom of interpretation, but this freedom of interpretation is always based on the unclarity of the text. You know, if the text is clear, if there's nothing to discuss, if you totally understand it, then you have no need for interpretation. You know, it's because something is not clear, because remains a void in the text. This void will call you for the midrash, for the rabbinic sacred art of interpretation, and this is how midrash is born. So there are many episodes in the Bible that emphasize this importance of misunderstanding, of multiple languages. The image that comes immediately to my mind, and maybe to yours, is the famous story of the Tower of Babel, and Tower of Babel. The fact that humanity at the core, at the beginning of the story, speaks Safa Achat, only one language. At the origin, we speak one language, but this precisely creates in the story social violence. There is a certain type of violence that comes from monolinguism, the fact that humanity speaks the same language and seems to understand each other. And then in the story, as you remember, God creates languages, plurality of tongues and languages, and this becomes the condition of a fight against violence. So again, it might feel counterintuitive. It suggests in the Bible that sometimes violence comes from perfect understanding and not from missing understanding. I think it's interesting to meditate this counterintuitive notion. So as I said in the last session, we discussed freedom and liberté. And when we think in the Bible, of course, of examples of freedom and liberation, the first example that comes to mind is a very central narrative, this narrative of the Exodus, leaving Egypt, leaving slavery, becoming a free people. We discussed in the last session the importance of brokenness in this emancipation process. You know, Moses comes down from Mount Sinai and he breaks the tablet. And this act of breaking something becomes like a pillar in Jewish tradition, a narrative pillar, but also a ritual pillar. You know, we keep repeating this gesture of breaking something, like breaking a glass at a wedding, breaking a matzah when the seder starts, etc., etc. Many stories can be told through the narrative of incompletedness. And today we're going to talk about other narratives in the Jewish tradition, about the narrative of equality. But before we start to invest this notion, I would like to start with a confession, maybe a recognition. Let me start by saying that when we talk about equality, I always feel that we, the French and the American people, don't really understand each other. There's a true misunderstanding or a problem of translation in the way we think about equality. That's not the only concept that we have a hard time translating on both sides of the ocean. You know, I believe and I feel that there are many words that somehow do not translate the same in America and in France today. We have a hard time explaining certain notions to one another. Many words that we use and seem not to imply the same thing in an American mind and a French mind. Let me give you a few examples. Maybe the most relevant example in the past year is the fact that it became clear for me in recent years that it's very, very difficult for me to explain to an Anglo-Saxon audience what laïcité means. You know, laïcité is the French word for secularism, but definitely it's not the same thing as secularism in the way Anglo-Saxon world uses that term. So it's laïcité is different from secularism because secularism is somehow perceived in America as freedom of religion, freedom to practice, freedom of belief, freedom to practice, whereas laïcité is often perceived but in the Anglo-Saxon world as a kind of anti-religious fundamentalism, as a kind of system that is very anti-religious signs, anti-veils, as if the French had a kind of allergy to religious belief or religious practice. And there's no way actually you can understand laïcité if you don't take a step and look at some historical background. If you look, for example, at how French secularism developed along history as a fight against pressure exercised by the Catholic Church for quite a long time, for many centuries. The strong pressures exercised by the Catholic Church against individuals contributed to the development of a promise of liberation of citizens from collective pressure, from the collective pressure exercised by religious institutions and by religious groups. And this is how in France in 1905 was voted a law, the law of laïcité, of absolute separation between state and religion, which promised to protect individuals' freedom and equality. So if you want, in a way, the way I could a little bit caricature this, laïcité is less a promise of freedom of religion than a promise of the possibility of a freedom from religion. And the République makes this promise to all its citizens, the French Republic. The way I could define it is that the laïcité promises French citizens that they will always be able to speak in the first person singular and will never be forced to speak in the first person plural. They're always able to say I, and somehow they're supposedly never saying we, except when they speak of the nation. The plural form, the collective is the nation. And people in the laïcité system of France can always speak in the first person singular. It's like a guarantee that the République will enable people not to be aggregated with their ethnicity and their birth or certain coercions that characterizes almost every religious institution as a way to deny the right of individual freedom for its member. And if you don't understand this historical background, then it becomes very difficult, for example, to understand all the issues, in the past years with the caricature at Charlie Hebdo, which you probably all heard about. For many in the world, and mostly in the Anglo-Saxon world, the caricatures of Charlie Hebdo, very anti-religious drawings, appear to be a provocation against religions. Whereas in France, those drawings are perceived to be the representation of a historical revolution, which is the right to criticize belief and sometimes to laugh and to question beliefs and to have some type of disrespect, not for the people, never a disrespect for the people, but some level of authorized disrespect for the belief in the name of your respect for individual and your respect for freedom of individuals. So this is one understanding, one misunderstanding from both sides of the ocean that we have a hard time clarifying. There are many other misunderstandings I feel and I experience in the past decades on both sides of the ocean in the language we use, which is not connotated with the same tone. For example, the word community. The word community in the United States is a very positive one. It's charged positively in the discourse, in the everyday discourse. Whereas in France, the notion of community and what we call in France communautarism is perceived to be a certain threat upon the nation for the same reason that I just explained, because the République is supposed to guarantee the rights and the freedom of the individual. Each time a group starts to define itself as a community or an ethnicity, it creates somehow a threat on this promise. And this is why sometimes the dialogue between France and America becomes complex, because we definitely do not use the same codes of languages. I'll give you another and last example. I'm always impressed that in America, it's so easy for people to start their sentence saying, for example, as a Black man, I believe that. As a gay woman, I believe this. As a Jew, I think that, etc., etc. This is definitely something that a French person wouldn't say. I think here in France, most of my friends or people around me would never start a sentence with a mark of affiliation to a community to state their point of view. Maybe it changed a little bit in recent years, but definitely it's not part of the historical background of identities and the way they are built here in France. Maybe we can develop that in the Q&A session. So to summarize, the American narrative often emphasizes the sacrality of freedom of belief, equality between communities, members of different religions and ethnic groups, whereas the French narrative emphasizes very often freedom from religion, equality between individuals in a kind of color blindness or affiliation blindness in the name of equality. And I think it's an important, long but important introduction to our discussion today about equality. And to clarify all the misunderstandings that I just noted, I would like us to engage now in a kind of detour through the Hebrew language and through biblical narratives to explore this notion of equality. So search for equality can lead us in very different directions when we look in the Jewish text, when we look in the Torah or in the Bible. There is indeed in the Bible emphasis in an emphasis in equality of rights between individuals, especially in situations of judgment, like in the name of justice. The Bible clearly says in the courtyard, equality between all is necessary in the face of the judges and in the face of justice. You probably remember there's a famous verse in the Bible. Actually, there are many verses which carry the same idea, the notion that the judges should not favor the rich over the poor, nor the poor over the rich. Other verses, especially in Leviticus, say that the scales should be equal in the market, or insist on the idea that the widow and the orphans should always have the same rights as the rich or as more privileged population. And these ethical notions are present, especially in the book of Leviticus. They represent what we often call the pursuit of justice, tzedek tirdof, the pursuit of justice, equality in the marketplace, equality in the justice system and the court all. But at the same time, in the biblical narrative and literature and in the rabbinic literature, there is no recognition of absolute equality between citizens, quote unquote, between people and groups. And there is a very central notion in the Bible that you all know that can be summarized in one word in Hebrew, the word kedusha, sanctity. There are certain times and certain people and group who have a specific kedusha. Shabbat is defined as being kadosh. The Hebrew people, later the Jewish people in rabbinic literature, are defined as a kadosh people. We often translate kadosh by sacred, but again, it's a misunderstanding because kadosh literally means set apart. In the same way that Shabbat is a time that is set apart in the calendar, the Jewish people in the rabbinic literature are set apart. And this is the core of this notion that we often translate, probably wrongly, as a Jewish election or Jewish chosenness. There is a kedusha of the Jewish people that set them aside for specific roles, missions, duties, 613 commandments versus 7 commandments for the rest of the world, etc., etc. This mission, this election, this kedusha seems to go totally against the notion of equality as we perceive it or envision it in a modern society. Sanctity is a matter of separation, and therefore it's a kind of inequality, but an inequality that doesn't mean injustice. Some people are just separate in their history, in their heritage, in their duty, and in their missions, maybe. So now let's dive a little bit further into etymology, into Hebrew roots. And let's think about the etymology of the Hebrew word for equality. You know, in modern Hebrew, equal is shaveh. Equality can be translated as shivyon. It comes from a root with 2 letters, shin, vav. As you know, in Hebrew, you probably all know this, Hebrew is polysemic. It means that each root in Hebrew gives birth to many, many different words, an entire vocabulary of words related somehow to each other. So when we look at this root, shin, vav, at the core of the word equality, it exists under other forms in the Bible. For example, in the Bible is repeated a word, shav, which means vanity, when something is done in vain. Remember the 2nd commandment given on Mount Sinai. The 2nd commandment says, Lo tisa et shem Elohecha lashav. You shouldn't pronounce God's name lashav, in vain, or you shouldn't swear with God's name. That's another way to translate it, because for the rabbis, shav or lashav means both in vain, but also introduces a notion of lie. You shouldn't give false testimony. It's again for them a translation of lashav. So from their point of view, this root, shin, vav, has always something to do with an unfit language. When you look, for example, at chapter 5 of Deuteronomy, of Dvarim, you might remember this verse that says, listen maybe to the Hebrew, you will hear this notion of shav repeated twice. Lo tisa et shem Adonai Elohecha lashav. You should not take the name of God in vain. Ki lo yanakeh Adonai et asher yisa et shmo lashav, because God will not hold guiltless the person who lies with his name. So you see, shav in the Torah means something equal, but also something that is not taken seriously, or even a lie, or a misuse of language of a kind or another. And then in the book of the prophets, in the mouth of Jeremiah and the mouth of Ezekiel, suddenly that root comes to define idolatry. Idolatry is, for the prophets, a certain cult given in vain, as if everything was equal, as if there was no distinction between truth and life and lies, deceiving yourself through a false God or worshiping the true God. And the last reference to shav you might think about shin vav in Hebrew, is a word that you all know also. It's the word shoah. Shoah in Hebrew means destruction, absolute violence and destruction. So think about it. All the words that I brought together in this Hebrew polysemy now, it's quite surprising indeed that the Hebrew uses the same word to define equality, which is supposedly something very positive, but it links it etymologically to other notions, notions that threaten truth and possibly have something to do with a lie or with violence or with destruction. So what is the type of equality that the rabbis believe in? What is the old Jewish wisdom about equality? Or why do they seem to want to warn us against something? To understand this, we need again to make a little journey through a text in the Bible that seems to speak about a question of equality, but also speaks in the same narrative about violence. It's a super famous passage, a passage that speaks about the very first violence of a man against his brother. You all know this passage in the Bible, Cain and Abel, the assassination of Abel by his brother Cain. Cain and Abel are the first children of humanity. The passage occurs in chapter 4 of Genesis, at the very beginning of the text. Just to situate the context, you probably remember, Cain is bringing fruit from the ground as an offering to God, and Abel is bringing elements of his flock to God. But remember, God accepts Abel's offering, but did not accept Cain's offering, pays no attention to that sacrifice. And then the Hebrew says, Vayachar leCain me'od. Cain became very upset, sad, angry. Vayiplu panav. That's a typical biblical expression. His face fell. Famous situation. Actually, it's the first situation of inequality in the Bible. Why should God make preferences? We obviously, at the beginning of this text, identify with Cain easily because we witness a kind of very typical brotherhood rivalry, something we probably all experienced in childhood, a situation that seems to us as being very unfair, very unequal. And a question in the text is asked to Cain. God asks a question and asks Cain a question, and therefore ourselves who identify with him. He wonders, what will Cain do with this anger, with this sadness and bitterness? And this is precisely what the verse says in chapter 4 of Genesis. God says to Cain, Lama chara lach, why are you upset? Velama naflu panecha, why has your face fallen? It's a very interesting rhetorical question, because obviously if God is God, he knows the answer, he knows the problem. But it seems to be almost a psychoanalyst question. God is asking Cain, what are you going to do now? And then the verse goes on like this, Im tetiv seta, if you do well, you will be lifted up. But if you do not do well, says God to Cain, sin is at the door. Its desire is upon you, and you may rule over it. Now, you know the rest of the story. Cain will not rule over his anger, over his bitterness. And immediately after this verse, he kills his brother. And this is the first violence, murder. But as you see, it has to do with an inability to face a situation of jealousy, of envy, of bitterness. And therefore, it's an ability to deal with a situation of perceived inequality. At the end of the story, you remember, Cain is condemned or sent to wander eternally in the world, and he becomes somehow the first wandering Jew, and Abel is dead. And this story can be interpreted in many, many different ways. You know, you can decide that you think that God is guilty, that he should have accepted Cain's offering from the beginning. He should have protected Cain's sensibility. He shouldn't have triggered his sadness, etc., etc. And there is here a situation of lack of equality that is unbearable. Or you can interpret it differently, and you can look at the way God in this story is just like a good parent or maybe a shrink, and seems to tell Cain, okay, inequality happens. You have a true perception of injustice, and it will occur again and again in your existence. But the question is, what will you do with it? Where is your sadness and your anger leading you? Is it leading you to bitterness and then to violence? Or is there for you a possibility, as the Hebrew says, im tetiv seta, for you to lift yourself up? And this question is actually where I want to take you tonight, because it's an ongoing political question. This story of Genesis, at the beginning of Genesis, keeps happening, keeps repeating itself. Each time an individual, or sometimes a group or a society, is facing a feeling of bitterness, very often perceives an inequality, an injustice that might be objective or subjective perception, well, the person of the group can use the situation as a condition of an uplifting, a reparation, a change, or it can lead him into violence and waves of violence. And actually, this chapter 4 of Genesis keeps reverberating in history, in different political situations, historical situation, in the same way that it reverberates in the Jewish calendar, by the way. And I open this parenthesis now. There are moments in our liturgy that seems to repeat somehow or to hint at this first brotherly conflict. For example, you might have noticed, if you ever attended a Yom Kippur service, you know, Yom Kippur is a day of justice, of judgment. And on Yom Kippur in the morning, we read the famous story of Leviticus, the scapegoat passage in Leviticus. You remember, the Leviticus tells us a story about two goats totally similar to each other, are presented on Yom Kippur to the high priest, and the two goats are similar in every way. They're just like two brothers, two twin goat brothers. But one will be sacrificed on the altar, will die on the altar, and the other animal, the scapegoat, will be sent to a kind of eternal wandering outside of the camp in the desert. And it's very easy to find resonance, similarities between the narratives of the two brothers of Genesis. One is sacrificed and the other wonders in the world, and the scapegoat situations. Those stories deal with questions of inequality and how does humanity tend to behave when it perceived or when it experiences inequality. Will you be led by bitterness? And then you can be pretty sure that violence is on the way, that scapegoats will be found on your way. Or can you find a way to lift up yourself? And you probably understand where I lead you for this conclusion before maybe we engage in a dialogue. Violence and hate in the world are paradoxically have often been perpetrated in the name of equality. When suddenly an actor in history perceives, just like Cain in the story, that he is victim of an injustice, he wants to be treated just like someone else that he perceives to be in a better situation than he is. And that type of violence is very, very often carried out in the name of what we could call an anti-kedusha, an anti what seems to be a part. When someone says, to say it more simply, why should someone else appear to have a different status than I am? And I think it's particularly true about anti-Semitism, about the anti-Semitic rhetorics. You know, in anti-Semitic rhetorics, Jews are very often accused, just like Cain accuses Abel of the same accusation. Why do they seem to get more love? Why do they seem to be chosen? Why do they seem to be privileged? Why them, says the anti-Semite, why them, the Jews, and not me? And jealousy and envy is often born out of a feeling of injustice and inequality that might lead us to the worst Shoah in the etymological meaning of the word, to the destruction of the world, and to the fact that we keep repeating this phenomenon of scapegoats in our society. This is why I think that a conversation and a reflection about equality is so essential, just like a conversation about justice. Equality and justice are sacred. Their quests often imply to recognize that our experiences are different. The kedusha of someone is not the kedusha of someone else. And equality is an aspiration, but it brings peace in its quest only when someone is able to never let his perception of difference lead him to a path of bitterness. And I think these political and spiritual questions are essential to address today. And in the context, and I'll conclude with this idea, in the context of the rise of anti-Semitism in France in recent years, and it's probably true not only in France, but all over the world, it's pretty clear that the anti-Semitic discourse is very often a discourse of bitterness. Someone perceives himself as having a fallen face, to use the Hebrew expression, of being victim of a kind of injustice. And very often Jews are accused of owning more, of being more, of having more, of being privileged in a way that justifies in the eyes of the bitter the violence that strikes them. That's why I believe anti-Semitism always goes hand in hand so well with conspiracy theories, because all of them have to do, and with scapegoats phenomenons, because all of them have to do with the perception that an invisible force, an external agent, is somehow manipulating my world and prevents me from being truly is equal. And I guess this is maybe where we can start our conversation again.
Rabbi, thank you so much. Where to start? I mean, I have to say, in the latter part of your talk, I couldn't help but think about the blessing that we give our children on Shabbat, in which we give them the blessing, maybe like Ephraim and Manasseh. And I was thinking so much about, as you were saying, okay, we start with Cain and Abel. And as you said, you could go through the various stories in Breshit, and they really don't get better. It's not like we have, this perceived, each story of perceived inequality leads to another sense of violence and jealousy and estrangement. And, we're coming soon upon, we just, entered the conversations about Jacob and Esau. We're moving on to Joseph and his brothers. And I just find it fascinating that what you're asking us to do is to really aspire and lift up our face, if you will, unlike Cain, lift up our face and get a sense of how do we approach a sense of inequality without delving into pools of bitterness and violence. Which is why I'd love to hear your thoughts about it. I think one of the reasons why we bless our children like Ephraim and Manasseh, twins who are not brothers, who are not recorded as having that same kind of violent thing. I don't know, any thoughts on that? Just as you were speaking, I realized this is our Shabbat blessing. This is what you're actually asking us to do, is something that we state every Friday night.
Yeah, I think Ephraim and Manasseh represent the possibility of a peaceful brotherhood based on the recognition that the other's blessing is not my blessing. And up until they get into the story, we notice that in Genesis, all the story that keeps repeating itself is a story of brotherhood rivalry, where a brother is convinced that the other brother got more than he got in the paternal blessing. And suddenly Ephraim and Manasseh step into the picture, and they seem to recognize that there is a certain inequality between them, but they can live with it. And also, so I think it's very powerful that we bless our children with those names. We could also bless our children with the name of other siblings, which seem to function quite well, which is Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. This triad. Right. Actually, it's the same story at the beginning of Exodus. We finally step into a family where siblings recognize, or seems to recognize, that they don't have the same role, that each one has a kedusha, like a sacred work to do, but each one in its field. And what could have appeared as inequality or power in the end of someone and not in the end of the brother suddenly seems totally acceptable, and they manage to build a true brotherhood, a very strong brotherhood. I also find very powerful the fact that we bless our children with those name of Ephraim and Manasseh. When Joseph names his children, he calls the first one Manasseh because he forgot the pain of his youth. Manasseh in Hebrew is something for forgetting, and then Ephraim means to be fertile, to what do you say in English, to blow, to blossom, maybe. And I find it always interesting that when we bless our children, we place our hands above their head, so we seem to put some weight above their head and shoulder. We seem to tell them, this is the weight of the past, this is the weight of transmission. But then we whisper into their ears, you know what, you should be able to forget, and you should be able to blossom. Wow. So I find this paradox is interesting, that we tell them, okay, don't move. This is heavy stuff. It's upon you. It's our history. Remember, remember, remember. But then in the ear, we say very softly, you know what? You can also forget part of it to blossom. Well, and forgetting is not a bad thing. Sometimes you need to forget elements, maybe of your bitterness, of your anxiety, of your fear, of your, everything that frustrated us in our life has to be somehow forgotten so that we can blossom.
Or, not necessarily like forget entirely, but what do you lead with? And I think that's what you're speaking towards. What I think is interesting with almost the ritual that you just, reenacted is, I was thinking over and over again, who's to blame? And, it's interesting. You mentioned, God kind of actually propping Cain up you have a choice as to kind of which direction you want to take this. And I'm kind of foreshadowing as to what events will unfold. But, when you think about the other biblical stories, usually we point to, well, it wasn't as if the parents were saying to the children, lead this, ethical and fair life and equal shares between your brothers. Quite the opposite. We see parents literally saying, deceive each other. I want you to deceive your father so that you get the birthright. Mm-hmm. And so I'm curious your thoughts about that in terms of raising children today. And when we speak about that idea of Kedusha as separate without delving into a sense of bitterness and violence, what does that kind of raising a child in that atmosphere look like?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think indeed in Genesis particularly, it seems that the trauma is repeated from generation to generation of preferring one child over the other. And it's interesting that it keeps repeating itself until children are aware of the trauma their parents carry with them. It requires a certain level of an ability to analyze a little bit what you're heir of, what your parents have been heir of, and therefore to be able to look with some, kindness, or a little bit more kindness at your parents' bruises in a way. For me, the epitome of that in Jewish tradition is the Passover table. Obviously, this is the holiday that speaks about translation the most powerfully. When we tell the story of the 4 children around the table, we speak about the sage and the rebellious child. And when we speak about the rebellious child, there is this moment in the Haggadah that people don't really listen to. The answer that is given to the rebellious child is ake et shinav, like it's said to the parents, you should knock his teeth.
Blunt his teeth. Yeah, exactly.
And we always wonder, why should we knock his teeth instead of, slapping him? Or I don't know. There could be other possibilities mentioned. But I think it's a hint at a specific verse in the Bible that you might remember. This verse that says, parents have eaten sour grapes and the children's teeth have been, I don't know how to say it in English, irritated. This verse from the prophet says that, the metaphor it uses is that sometimes parents eat sour grapes and the teeth of the children feel it generation later. So it's the imagery of transgenerational transmission. Yeah. And I think that when you say to the parent on Passover, when you say to the parent of a rebellious child, ake et shinav, like knock his teeth, you're actually bringing back this notion of parental responsibility. And the parents is invited to wonder, maybe the rebellion of my child has something to do with something I did, not with something he did. Like the rebellion of my child is a reaction to the sour grapes that I ate. It has nothing to do with him, but with my history that reverberates in his. So I think Judaism has a lot to teach about, obviously, about intergenerational conversation and parental responsibility and children responsibility also in their history.
I think everyone who's listening is now going to look at that's, step in the Seder, and, part during the telling of the story in a very different way. Because certainly I think most people, I say most, but I think many of us, when we look at that step in the Seder, we think, why is this child acting this way? There isn't necessarily, like, as you're explaining, a sense of responsibility. They don't look at the second part of that verse. I'd love to transition for a second, because I thought it was fascinating as you're speaking about how in France there's a freedom, or in the name of equality, I hope I got this correctly, in the name of equality, there's a freedom from labels. Correct?
Well, actually,
say that I am, a white woman, or I am. So I wanted to hear a little bit about your experience, because would you ever say, I am a female rabbi? I'm one of 3 female rabbis, and I'm curious if you could speak a little bit to that, labels in your own life, and whether or not there is a possibility for a positive outcome in using those labels.
Yeah. Well, again, it goes back indeed to French history, but I'm going to try to be clearer, because I'm aware it's complex for someone who grew up in America and really live in a totally different world of identity definitions. You know, when I say in France, when I say as a white woman or as a Jew, I believe that there is a feeling that I'm violently enroll with me white people and Jews in an opinion that supposedly is only mine, you know. And there's always a feeling that when you start your sentence or when you deliver an expression, which is a personal expression, and you, sorry for the word, you dare unrolling with you your color, your ethnicity, or your group, you speak in their name.
Right, you're speaking on behalf of everyone.
Yeah. And they didn't ask you anything, you know. Sometimes I feel that when people in France say that as Jews, they believe that or they think that, I feel in a way, you know, violated in my, you know, why by force they take me into their belief. You know, there's always like a threat when you speak in the name of a collective. And I'm aware that sometimes you have to do this, you know. We belong to very different groups. You know, I'm a Parisian, I am a mother of children, I lived in America for many years. All these definitions make me part of a group. But we should always pay attention when we tend to think that what we believe is just the product of an affiliation, you know, because there are many ways to think as a white woman, or, you know, and I very often disagree with other white women, you know, so I think it's from a French perspective, which gives so much emphasis on the individual right in the name of equality. It's a language we find a bit suspicious, you know, and I totally understand that in America, it carries other histories and translations. But I think it's interesting, again, that's why I'm so obsessed with questions of translations, because I think that actually, even when we use the same word in 2 different countries, we don't use the same word. They don't have the same notions. Yeah.
And if somebody, sorry, go ahead.
You know, in recent years, I learned to define myself. You know, when I start a sentence, very often here I multiply the affiliation to make it richer. You know, I will start a sentence saying, as a rabbi, as a woman, as a Parisian, as someone who likes to eat sushi, and as someone who never goes to the gym, you know, and I could multiply like this.
You're my kind of person, just letting you know.
So if you make it more complex, then you can start speaking, I think, in the name of different belongings. But I would be really, you know, I would be threatened by simplifications of affiliations, which for me are always, I mean, can lead us, I think, in dangerous directions.
No, I appreciate that. And there's a few comments. I'm going to get to those comments in just a moment. I mean, I just think it's a fascinating idea, just to revisit it for a second, that the idea of Kedusha, you know, I don't know if this happens in France, but we use that idea of like Kedusha, Kehillah, Kedusha. We use it so freely. We're a holy community. And what does it mean to be a holy community? And I just appreciated, it's true. It's very rare, I think, now I'm speaking collectively, okay? But it's very rare, I think, for many rabbis here in America to invoke that definition of a holy community. What's a Kehillah Kedosha? Really, the translation, it's a separate community. That's actually the intention of the translation.
The idea of setting apart.
What?
The idea
of setting apart, of what it means to be set to be set apart.
Of setting apart, it's a complex notion when you want to be, especially I think in progressive Jewish world, when we want to emphasize inclusivity, openness. Kedusha implies frontiers, because there's no Kedusha if there is no wall, if there is no frontier. So the question is, how do we deal with a certain level in our communities, a certain level of porosity and openness to keep them alive, but acknowledging also that Kedusha can't be an open field. Kedusha requires certain level of impermeability, certain walls that separate, that set apart what is and what is not. Shabbat from the rest of the week, Havdalah between times, between people, belonging, not belonging. Our tradition is very centered on the idea of operating, separation, Havdalot.
And, it speaks to the idea of kashrut. We have so many ideas of things being set apart. And I guess I'm just wondering, does set apart have to mean unequal? Does there have to be a sense of differences in equality when something is set apart? Is that inherent?
Yeah, well, it depends on how we define equality again, but I think that separation suggests that there is inequality, but inequality doesn't mean injustice.
That's right.
And doesn't mean indignity, and this is where
that's what we teach.
Important. Yeah, that's actually the question of dignity and the question of justice should be our priority, and it can go hand in hand with inequality.
Interesting.
The idea that different blessings, and I think that when suddenly people all consider they deserve the same blessing, they want to speak the same language. I'm going back to the Abel story.
Yeah, right, perfect.
When we speak one language, then it's the beginning of violence, because we need separation of tongues, separation of territories and language to engage in a dialogue. It's interesting that in Hebrew, Brit, the covenant, is always associated with the verb lichot Brit, which means, in English and in French, we talk about sealing a covenant, whereas Hebrew talks about cutting a covenant, like when you seal a covenant.
So fascinating. Right.
So actually you can make an alliance and a deal and a covenant only if you first recognize that there is a cut between you and the other, that you're not me, I'm not you, and therefore we can engage in a dialogue and a covenant. But if we don't recognize the wall or the void that separates our world and our languages, then there's no reason we're going to start talking to each other, because you'll be me, I'll be you, So it comes together necessarily with separation, but we need to make sure it doesn't come with injustice and indignity.
And that's what I'm taking from today. I'm sorry, go ahead. I missed what you just said.
No, unfortunately, very often we have to admit, in the religious world, in part of the Jewish world today, separation and kedusha goes hand in hand with leaving aside in a state sometimes of indignity, a category of population that wouldn't belong. And the list could be long. Sometimes it's the question of the feminine. Of course, you and me know well the question of what is the, can femininity have room in the conversation, or do women stay out of the sacred conversation of study in Judaism? And sometimes the left out are converts, interfaith couples. The list is very long. We know today.
I'm looking at the time. I didn't ask you even one question that I prepared, but what I would want to ask you is, in terms of, I don't want to speak for you in terms of this being a mission for your life, but when I hear that idea that inequality should not delve into injustice, which then leads to violence. I'm curious how, maybe one of my last questions here, we'll see how that plays out into your everyday work. I know that you are constantly professionally reaching out to groups that are outside of the Jewish community, or are not just, I'd say even one of the articles I read in terms of reaching out to the ultra-Orthodox community or the Muslim community. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that work that you're doing, and also what's next for you.
Well,
not fair to ask you.
Well, in my rabbinate, what I'm trying to do now for years is that I feel we are in a time where so many people build walls, and I'm trying to build bridges somehow. And so I'm trying to build bridges with people who are often convinced we have no conversation going on, like bridges with the Orthodox and the ultra-Orthodox world sometimes. Where I grew up, I come from a very Orthodox background. Sometimes bridges with in France with people who are convinced that in the name of laïcité, we can't speak about belief, or building bridges with Muslims and Christian, and something I'm doing, or going to, I go a lot now to jails in France and to schools to teach about religion, also in Judaism. And I'm trying to re-engage in this conversation, but it's in this time of wall building, it's not very easy to give you an example. In my conversation with the Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox world, very often the people I talk with, the difference between me and them is not our level of practice, and it's not our relationship to text or our belief. But actually, the main difference between them and me is that very often they believe they're the real Judaism, and I believe that none of our Judaism is the true one. Like, the real difference, and it's a major philosophical difference, is that they believe they represent the true Judaism.
The path.
Yeah, and I believe that their Judaism is not truer, or mine is even not truer or more authentic than theirs. And I believe that Judaism can speak through different languages. And this recognition of different voices being equally authentic and valid sometimes vulnerabilizes, I don't know if you can say it in English, make it more vulnerable, my position. But I think it's the condition for true dialogue. So this is what I'm trying to do now, create bridges, sometimes with people who did not envision or consider that Jewish teachings could bring something into their life. I'll give you maybe an example about what I'm doing now. I read my last book in France was released about 6 months ago. And I'm very surprised of the effect of this book. It's an absolute bestseller here in France.
Wow. Mazel tov.
But it's a book about death and mourning in Judaism. And I thought when I wrote this book that it would speak to the Jewish community mainly. And now I received thousands of letters of people who read it and feel that it's leading them to in unexpected directions to consider how they experience mourning processes, and how diving into Jewish thought can teach them something about their own mourning processes. And in the context of the pandemic, of course, so many people went through painful mourning processes. It became very central. And so for me, that's, to answer your question, where am I going? I don't know where I'm going, but I'm trying in many, many different directions to build bridges with other worlds and enter in dialogue with them.
Thank God for that. I just wanted to end with, when I was doing a little bit of research on you, Rabbi, I came across the story about your grandfather serving as your inspiration. That I believe when you were 17, your grandfather asked you what you wanted to study. You said med school, and he responded, "I would have imagined something else for you." And in reading the story, you said he didn't say what, and that was so impactful, that he wasn't saying, "Oh, I imagine this path or this path or this path," but rather his silence gave an opening for you. It opened a door, I believe you said, where suddenly something became possible, and that was the rabbinate. And I feel so much gratitude to your grandfather for opening that path so that we have the pleasure and the blessing of having you as our scholar during the Abner and Roslyn Goldstine Scholar in Residence Series 2021. Thank you so much for your insight, for this really in-depth conversation. I know that everyone watching and who will be watching feels that much more enriched by your learning. Thank you so much.
Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.